Are countries led by women leaders better at fighting COVID-19 than their male counterparts? Since the pandemic broke out, the relationship between female leaders and their effectiveness in handling the coronavirus has received a lot of attention, as countries led by women such as New Zealand and Germany saw half as the number of COVID fatalities on average as those headed by men, as well as fewer cases due to their early prevention policies. But is it all down to this? And what do these recent developments tell us about what we need from national leaders during this pandemic? For this, we're joined by Jennifer Piscopo, Associate Professor of Politics at the Occidental College. We also connect with Charles Zeldin, Professor of History and Political Science at Nova Southeastern University. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Glad to be here.
Thank you.
Well, let's go with ladies first. So, Jennifer, since earlier this year, countries with female leaders have noticeably fared better amid the COVID-19 pandemic. They've shown a rather greater ability to contain the virus, as well as a lower number of fatalities. So you actually conducted a study on this where you compared female and male heads of state across heads of government across 37 OECD countries. And would you say that there is a degree of causality?
What we actually find when we look at the information is that there's something really unique about the countries that have female leaders right now. And it's actually not just that the countries are better at containing the pandemic, but these are countries that seem high on measures of things that political scientists call state capacity. So these are countries that have impartial bureaucracies, they have strong bureaucracies, they have high levels of citizen trust in government, and they have high levels of social spending. And these are trends that are developed over time and aren't just responsive to a single leader in office. So what drew my attention was that a lot of the countries that were cited as both having women leaders and having contained the coronavirus very well were also these countries that scored very high on these high capacity measures. So in my study, I looked at high capacity countries, whether led by women or by men, and I found that high-capacity countries did better at containing the coronavirus, no matter what the leader gender was. So there's actually something right now about high-capacity countries that are more likely than other countries to elect women, and those are also the countries that are more likely to have better and earlier efforts at disease control. So there is a pattern about women leaders. The pattern is especially about the kinds of countries that right now are likely to have elected women.
So it's not as simple as just having a female leader that leads to a better COVID-19 pandemic response, but really the social conditions, the trust in government, and also the system itself that really matters. I believe that's what you were saying. But, well, yes. Charles, what are your observations? Do you think maybe female leadership indicates a high level of equality or inclusion or democratic awareness that allowed maybe a better response to COVID-19?
I definitely agree that countries that have a better working government are likely to respond better to COVID, and many of them are more likely to have women leaders. But if we look, for example, in the United States at governors, where we have a number of women leaders, what we find is that very often what the variety or what separates them out is their politics. So you have Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, who responded quickly to the COVID crisis. And then you have governors in Alabama and in Iowa and in South Dakota, all Republicans, who basically have done as bad as the governor of my state, DeSantis, in Florida. And we're not what you want to be modeling yourself on when it comes to responding to COVID. So I think it actually has more to do with the nature of government than it is the fact that women are leading the government. But a well-organized society is more likely to bring in women leaders who are more likely to be more effective in some of the things that we need in times of crisis.
Well, as you were saying, yes, it's hard to just pin this all down to one person or have them take all the credit for it. It's rather down to the whole system itself, the nature of that society. But, well, Jennifer, regardless, what do you think this pandemic has taught us about what people really value in leadership in times of a crisis like this?
Sure. What I think is fascinating is why this idea that women leaders perform better at the pandemic has really captured the public imagination. And one of the reasons that it captures the public imagination is that political office still tends to be associated with men, which then means the stereotypical qualities that we attach to men, such as strength and aggression, become associated with the qualities that also make a good political leader. Except a pandemic is a really different kind of crisis, right? You can't fight a virus with military strength. You can't fight a virus by bullying it or yelling at it. And so I think one of the reasons this idea of women leaders performing better in the pandemic has been so powerful to people is that it lifts up a more stereotypically feminine leadership style. And I'm saying stereotypically very carefully because these are qualities that men and women all have, but they are also qualities that we stereotypically attribute to men versus women. And so some scholars suggest that what voters want in a pandemic is not sort of strength and aggression and military bluster, but they want to be reassured. They want to be told that it's going to be okay. They want empathy for the struggles that a pandemic and sheltering in place and all of the economic effects produce. And so we see some of these women leaders, like Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, being able to exercise that empathy very effectively. So it could be that in a pandemic, the kinds of qualities we want to see in our leaders change, and that might facilitate the ability of women leaders to be effective.
Right, so perhaps it's because we've seen some leaders basically ignoring the pandemic and saying, you know, it's going to be okay, I can beat the virus, I don't need to wear a mask, maybe that kind of thing. People across the world didn't value so much in their leaders. So really, Charles, the same question goes to you. What do you think, what does the relative success of countries that are being led by women right now tell us about what we want from our leaders during this pandemic?
Well, I have to agree that what we want are leaders who communicate well, and who communicate well on a personal level, who make you feel that you're a part of the effort at dealing with and fighting the COVID, and that your government is working with you, not against you. And the style of many strongmen politicians, which can be very effective in other situations, is anything but that. Their whole point is to almost alienate members of society. Basically, I alone can fix it. Well, when it comes to something like COVID, you can't fix it alone. It's got to be a team effort. So you see, for example, and again, this is an example of a male leader, but Trudeau in Canada shares many of the same qualities as the women we're talking about. Very empathetic, reaches out, coalition building, and Canada has done a particularly good job at dealing with COVID compared to the United States and our president. So I might suggest we almost flip the statement, which is it's not that women are good at this, it's that there are a lot of male leaders who are simply very bad at this.
Right, so really we're speaking in numbers, we're seeing quite a number of world leaders being rather apathetic to this whole crisis, I believe. And well, Jennifer, what do you think? Would you agree with that? I mean, in contrast, what kind of leadership styles do you think have rather damaged public confidence?
Right, so if we think about what encourages trust in government, it's seeing that government works well for you. So one thing that's been really damaging to public confidence in this crisis is when there isn't a clear message coming from the government. So for instance, what those of us in the United States, Dr. Zeldin and I have lived through is conflicting messages coming from the executive branch. You know, our bureaucracy says something, our president says something else, a sort of public health expert says a third thing. And that's really confusing and overwhelming for folks when it's really important that everyone be on the same page. So there is some evidence that women are more likely to have a cooperative leadership style. That's not just women. I think Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada is an excellent example of a man also having a cooperative leadership style. And one important thing about cooperation is creating that consistent messaging from all individuals at all levels of the bureaucracy and the executive, because the conflicting messaging just sows disarray and it sows confusion. And what we see in the United States is it makes individuals much less likely to follow the best practices that are necessary to containing the pandemic, such as not having large parties.
Well, Charles, when you look at Germany's Angela Merkel or New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda, you wouldn't really necessarily say they're very similar people or have similar personality types, but what do you think they did have in common that really helped them respond effectively and very quickly to the virus?
Well, a couple things. One, they listened. They listened to the scientists, they listened to the opposition, they listened to the people of their country, and they responded accordingly. They responded quickly with a coherent and uniform message. No one would consider Angela Merkel as a warm and cuddly compared to some other leaders, but she's very consistent in her messaging, and she's very open to her people. This is what's happening. This is what we can do, and that sort of messaging. Well, I'll take an example of an alternative. One governor in America who was very effective was Governor Cuomo in New York, and nobody would call him particularly cuddly, warm, or even consensus building. But what he was consistent, open, he listened. And so I think those elements are the key. What we find, though, is that we're more likely to find them in societies in which you have women leaders, and they seem to be more effective as a result.
And this question goes to both of you, but as we go forward, we're saying we're lacking a lot of global coordination right now, and also communication between leaders, cooperation between them. How do you think this should come about? Why don't we go with you first, Jennifer?
I think one of the challenges about the pandemic is that it arrives in its higher moments and its lower moments to countries in different ways, right? And that really creates a barrier to coordination across countries because countries are dealing with peaks and spikes at different moments, right? And so when a country is looking inward, if it's facing a particular peak or spike, that might make it more difficult for that country to look outward. And I think countries face different domestic constituencies with different preferences. I think one of the challenges too about this, women leaders containing COVID better is that as you yourself mentioned, countries are dealing with different resources or different endowments. So if you are New Zealand or Iceland, both countries with women prime ministers, it's much easier to close your borders because you're an island, right? So even something as simple as that gives countries different advantages and disadvantages. If you're a mainland European Union country, it can be much more difficult to close your borders. If you're in the United States and you have a federal system, different states are having valleys and peaks of the virus at different moments. They're in crisis mode at different moments, and they also can't seal off their borders to each other. So I think part of what is hard about this pandemic is the way it unfolds in these waves, spikes, valleys, makes it really difficult for leaders to coordinate. And we are in a world of open borders. And so shutting borders, which is among the better things that you can do to contain this virus, it's something islands can do quite effectively, is also politically difficult in certain countries relative to others.
But they shouldn't try to stir those differences, though, should they, by pointing the finger or blaming another country or just shutting off borders without any kind of, room for more diplomacy or reconciliation. What do you think, Charles?
Well, one of the factors it's playing here is that over the last 3 to 5 years, we've seen a shattering almost of the international world order within the West. A lot of that's the fault of our president, but a lot of that is also trends that were already starting before Trump became president. And this crisis of confidence within the West, and the breaking down of alliances and of working together came at a really bad time with COVID. And as a result, what you're seeing is not only a failure to work together, but you're also seeing a failure to trust one another. Instead, what we're seeing is countries looking at other countries as the cause or the threat or the competition. And it's going to get way worse when we actually have a workable vaccine. And now there's a competition for who gets it first and who gets it the most. Ideally, we'll have leaders who will work internationally to make this work as a whole, because that's more effective. But domestically, sometimes that isn't the most palatable political option available.
But at the same time, I think this the whole spotlight on female leaders here does show that we are moving towards a time where people want more empathy from leadership and cooperation, so that these national differences should be, in a way, they should be smoothed over, and leaders should be trying to cooperate and trying to send us more consistent messages, as you both mentioned. Well, I'm afraid we're out of time today, so we're going to have to wrap up the discussion here. But that was Jennifer Piscopo, Associate Professor of Politics, and Charles Zeldin, Professor of History, both joining us from California and Florida. Thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, thank you for watching. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow with more global insights on issues making headlines. Have a lovely day or evening wherever you are. Goodbye.